Hello everybody, welcome to week 4 of our Global Ethics course. Hope everybody's doing well. Just want to follow sort of a similar format in this video as I have in the past. I want to talk a little bit about the topics we covered last week with universalism, and then I'm going to look just briefly what we have coming up this week as far as relativism goes. So the general consensus that I got from reading the discussions of Kant and his categorical imperative discussion, the groundwork, is most people think that the categorical imperative is flawed because there are just too many counterexamples, too many objections to lying, for instance, as a universal law. One of the exceptions that was brought up was sort of a famous objection that was made by a guy who actually lived during Kant's time, called Benjamin Constant. He gave the example of, for example, if lying is universally wrong, then if a murderer shows up to your door looking for someone, then you are morally obliged to not lie to that person and to tell them where this person is. And of course, the consequences of that seem outrageous, and even Kant admitted that when Constant presented him with the objection. But the important thing to remember is that when Kant draws his distinction between hypothetical and categorical imperatives, Kant is looking for a principle that is not based on the consequences at all. What Kant is trying to do is he's trying to find an a priori, which in philosophy a priori is a term that's used to mean prior to experience, an a priori principle that can be applied in morality, and that is the categorical imperative. Obviously, the distinction between the hypothetical imperative, which the hypothetical imperative that Kant points out is something that is conditional. For example, if you want to be rich, then you need to get a job. Would be the hypothetical imperative would be if you want to get rich, then the imperative is that you get a job. Whereas with the categorical imperative, Kant is looking for something that is not conditional, something that holds universally. Another distinction that Kant draws, and it's unfortunate that we didn't get a chance to read this because he brings this out in another part of the groundwork, and that's one of the problems that we're encountering, that we encountered quite a bit, I think, this past week in discussion, is that we just didn't have enough time to read, because the groundwork is about 100 pages, maybe a little more, and the same with Rawls' Laws of the People. A lot of the things and a lot of the objections that you all rightly raised, they both address in different parts of the book, but unfortunately we just don't have time in this abbreviated course to look at those. But anyway, one of the distinctions that Kant draws in the groundwork, and another part of it, is the distinction between what's good and what is right. And what is good has to do with the consequences of an action. For example, in the murderer example, not lying to the murderer, if you do lie to the murderer, then the consequences will probably be good, the fact that the person doesn't get murdered. And that's what Kant considers the good. But in fact, what Kant says about the good in the groundwork is that the actual good or the consequences of an action are actually morally neutral, and they don't hold moral import at all. And that's because Kant is trying to find this a priori principle that is not in fact concerned with the good at all, but is concerned rather with what Kant calls the right. And the way that Kant arrives at the right is through the categorical imperative. And Kant gives 4 conditions for trying to parse out what is the right and what fits into the categorical imperative. And that's part of the reason that he gives those examples at the end, to show how they are not consistent with the categorical imperative. So the first thing you have to do when you're trying to find a categorical imperative is you have to put this maxim of whatever you want to make into universal law in your own words. For example, I say, you should not steal. I think that I should not steal to benefit myself. So that would be the first step in creating a categorical imperative. The second is you universalize that maxim. So instead of saying I should not steal for my own benefit, you say people should not steal for their own benefit to the detriment of others, or something along those lines. So you universalize it. The third step is you ask, is this maxim consistent, logically consistent? For example, there's an example that Kant gives about stealing, where he demonstrates that stealing is actually contradictory if you run the entire scenario out. So is the principle consistent, or if the principle is made universal, will it lead to a contradiction? And if it will, then it's not going to be a categorical imperative, or universal law, I should say. And the final step in trying to determine universal laws is determining whether something is actually doable or not. And if it's not doable, then you get into something based on the third and the fourth principles. You have something called a perfect duty and imperfect duty, but that falls a little bit outside of the scope of what we're talking about here. So anyway, that's what Kant's trying to set out to do. He's trying to find an a priori way of determining whether there are universal moral principles, and he thinks there are, but obviously when you try to give examples and see how that would play out, you can lead into a lot of you get into problems, as Constant pointed out, and as several of you pointed out as well. And even Kant mentions that in the reading. He points out the problem that you run into when you try to give examples of universal laws is once you actually make an example, you can't distinguish whether you're talking about a hypothetical imperative or a categorical imperative, because you don't know the motivations behind why people are trying to are endorsing a particular action. Is it in fact hypothetical because they're looking for something for their own benefit, or is it categorical because it follows these sort of four a priori conditions? But even if you have a problem with Kant's conception of the categorical imperative and willing that your action become a universal law, I think it does bring up a really important moral consideration, and that's when you're considering whether something is moral or not. I think an important consideration is to ask yourself whether that moral principle can be universalizable. And if you're interested in that, and there's another famous philosopher who sort of takes Kant's universalizable rule and takes it towards a more sort of not really utilitarian, but more of a particularist is the word I'm looking for, more particular spin. It's a philosopher by the name of R.M. Hare, and he talks about universalizability in actions, and it's in a very famous ethical book called Moral Reasoning. So if you're interested in that at all, the principle of universalizability and applying that to particular situations, then I suggest that you take a look at Hare. So the second thing that we read this week was Rawls, an excerpt from Rawls' Laws of the People, and looking at his 8 principles that he was suggesting to be laws of the principles, or I'm sorry, laws of the people. Most people seem to sort of like Rawls' principles. I think the general consensus was the principles are good, but they're a little bit too general. And here again, we have the same problem that we had with Kant, in that a lot of the rest of the book is actually dedicated to sort of trying to make these principles more specific, talk about certain conditions and assumptions that go along with each of these principles, and how they need to be qualified in certain circumstances. But interestingly enough, there were, even with some of the counterexamples and qualifications people mentioned, there were quite a few people that thought that there were actually even some of these principles that sort of applied universally. For example, the principle about observing treaties, the principle that people be treated as equals, and the principle that if people are suffering or in dire need in another country, there's a responsibility to help out those people. So it's interesting that people do think that there may be universal principles that apply through Rawls' Laws of the People. And that brings me to a question of, what is it about Rawls' formulation of principles